Hi, this is my review of Dungeon of Terror Virtual Box Set by 01 Games. This is not just a map set, this is not just some images and tiles that you can use to represent an adventure site. This is an entire mega dungeon that can easily be filled with the stats of any fantasy system that you are using. There's a lot of information here, background to different zones and to the overall Dungeon of Terror. You have everything here just set up to add a few things related, as I was saying, to the role-playing game that you want to use with this virtual box set. Before we begin with the review, I have to inform you that at the moment of this review there is actually a bundle of holding offer right now from 01 Games. I recommend that you check that out. I have actually reviewed some of the maps in that offer, so I'm going to put the link in the description below so you can check that out. Now, I'm going to talk about the quality of the content and also the content itself as I go through with the review. So what do you get with this virtual box set? You have 8 set of tiles, that is for all of the zones of this Dungeon of Terror. You also have a set of tables and templates and an entire map of the dungeon complex. Everything is high quality. Everything is well written and organized. The images are also very clear, so the quality department is just excellent. Now, let's talk about the tables first. You have random tables for all of the zones of the Dungeon of Terror. This is really useful and it's easy to apply or convert to any fantasy system that you can imagine. If you wanted to, if you are playing sort of like a science fantasy type of game, or a steampunk type of game, for example like Victorian orcs and such, these tables will also be quite useful. So you just need to roll your 20-sided die, and you get random encounters for different zones, and you even have a special table that you roll a 6-sided die, and through that sub-table, you may encounter non-player characters or other interesting things within that particular zone of the Dungeon of Terror. You also have a set of room templates. These are basically sheets that you can use to organize different notes and descriptions and the contents of each room within the different zones. So this is a great way to keep everything neatly organized and to keep track of what is going on within each room and each zone. And if you wanted to create some sort of relationships or cause and effects between the different factions, this is going to be also quite useful if you use it with the full map of the Dungeon of Terror. With each set of tiles, you have some very useful buttons. First, you have the already well-known Rule the Dungeon button by 01 Games. This button allows you to modify pretty much everything about the different tiles, different map sections. So if you want to remove the text, you can do that. If you want to see a section of the map without the tiling marks, you can also remove them. You can also remove the furniture. Very useful to use these tiles as more generic tiles. Perhaps draw your own furniture. You can also remove the doors. You can set the grid to look as a square grid or as a hex grid or no grid at all. You can also control the feel of the walls, the filling. You could have a black feel or a gray feel. I actually really like the gray feel. I think that there is a very nice contrast with the black lining of the furniture, the grid and such. Or you could also remove the feel in its entirety. You also have the sections separated by black lines, and you can click on any of the tiles to either print that particular tile or go to that tile. Let's talk a bit about the background story of the Dungeon of Terror. What is this dungeon? Well, this dungeon is supposed to be quite ancient. There was another ancient mine before it, but this was shapen by a clan of dwarves. And eventually this dungeon was conquered by an evil mage by the name of Infidus the Black. Now, Infidus the Black, being a good dungeon overlord, he started to fill the dungeon with traps, arcane mysteries, and monsters, all sorts of magical experiments. And he started ruling over this entire dungeon complex, and those that went into the dungeon seeking secrets and glory and gold, they ended up dead or missing. Until one very skilled assassin got into this dungeon, and it is said that he managed to kill Infidus the Black. Nobody knows if this assassin actually killed this evil mage. Some say that actually the assassin failed and some horrible curse was placed upon him, or that the mage was killed but he came back as a sort of like a really powerful lich. So there is a lot of mystery, and you can play around with the empty gaps of the story. And let me just give you a few small details on the entire thing. The story goes into just enough to give you a sense or a narrative framework of the history of the Dungeon of Terror. Later on, other monsters, undead creatures, people with really bad intentions began moving into the dungeon. So now the dungeon is a mega dungeon with a great diversity of threats and even opportunities. And so all of the zones are ruled by a particular set of monsters. First, let's talk about the section of the dungeon ruled by an orc tribe. They worship the one-eyed god, perhaps Grumsh. So they are in this part of the dungeon, and they follow a black-skinned giant orc by the name of Crookdoer. In this zone of the dungeon, you could perhaps run into orc soldiers, or acolytes to this one-eyed orc god, or beastmasters, different types of guards. And on the special table, you could even run into Krutgur himself, the leader of the orcs, and all of his guards as well. I like how this part of the dungeon, even though it looks really savage because of the orcs are ruling here, it also has a bit like ritualistic feel to it, like there is some sort of vile temple to some evil deity. There are bones in some parts and strange arrangements around a statue. There are some really unkept and dirty, perhaps even gory places in this zone of the dungeon. So it reflects how the orcs just want a place like where they can eat and sleep and perhaps capture prisoners or eat the prisoners. And also they want to worship this one-eyed orc god. So I like it how this section, even though it feels a bit like a stronghold type of area with weapons and tables and such, it also feels like it's some sort of vile temple. Now, all of these different zones have names for the different tiles, that is, the different names for rooms and the corridors and the vaults. And you also have a lot of details, a lot of background story. Considering this is just a set of tiles, it's great that they included the story, the reason of why things are happening in each zone of the dungeon. So as I was saying, this is basically an entire mega dungeon waiting for you just to feel the stats of the enemies and the traps, perhaps. The next zone is ruled by an assassin's brotherhood. This brotherhood made their hideout and perform all sorts of evil and illegal activities, such as slavery, torture, and wars. The types of random encounters that you may find in this assassin's brotherhood section: you could run into thugs, or assassins, obviously, but also ninja. There are ninja here. And if you're not careful, you could run into some powerful non-player characters, such as Shine and Sandaria. This part of the dungeon feels a bit more austere, but also with a lot more emphasis on torture when compared, for example, with the orc zone. You have different torture devices. You have some places that could serve as cells, but also some places of habitation for the assassins. It looks a bit more pragmatic and not as religious as the one with the orc temple dedicated to the one-eyed god. Although there are some areas that could feel a bit more on the ritualistic side, but they are few. You also have some places with giant spider webs, so maybe you want to put some giant spiders in there. That could be a good idea. I'm thinking that this section ruled by assassins could also be... maybe there could be some other assassin clerics or assassin mages working in this area, considering there are a few places that look somewhat arcane. You have some zones in the dungeon that were never conquered by the dungeon invaders, that is, other monsters and, for example, the assassins and such. These places are almost untouched. They are the Mage Chambers, and here they feel quite a bit apart in theme and perhaps mechanically, depending on the system that you use, from the other zones of the dungeon that have living, breathing inhabitants. So, for example, in this section 3 of the Mage Chambers, you see the difference immediately with the random encounters presented in the tables. Here you could run into all sorts of mechanical and magical traps, but maybe there are also thugs or even a group of non-player characters. Perhaps they are friendly, perhaps they are enemies. You could also run into, for example, Sawajin, or some very nasty foes such as Medusa, or Sir Maximus, or ghosts. So in this section, this doesn't feel like it's made for someone to live here and prosper here. There are some rooms that are simply there to kill intruders or to fool them. Many places with statues and markings on the floor and with numbers, and they just feel like they are perfect to be used as some sort of puzzle. Maybe it's a puzzle that encompasses the entire zone, or a puzzle related to all of the other zones in the dungeon. So many dangerous places that you simply do not want to navigate without having the proper specialist, or a lot of healing potions and perhaps something else, something magical that will potentially save you from certain death. There are also some magical zones in this part of the Dungeon of Terror. And then we have the maze. It is said that the ghost of a minotaur is haunting these halls. Here you're going to find all sorts of teleport traps, perhaps other groups of adventurers, and zombie minotaurs as well, so it's not just the ghost of a minotaur. You may actually run into the spectral minotaur lord himself, but you could also find elementals and pitfall traps, etc. So this is a very dangerous place. This is a place that you can toy around with the adventurer's perception of the dungeon layout. With those teleport traps, if they are not careful and trying to make sense of things as they map the entire labyrinth, it's quite easy for them to get lost, get ambushed perhaps by the spectral or zombie minotaurs, or by the minotaur lord, as I was telling you. Maybe it's not worth it to go into this place looking for riches. Then we have section 5. This is another section of the Mage Chambers. This was not invaded by the other factions. And you have places such as the Dark Library, the Room of the White Dragon, the Arena, Chamber of the Bone Organ, the Yellow Tree, and the Lost City, which is a great miniature scale city. It's quite mysterious. It represents some forgotten city in a desert area. So this is another section great for puzzles, some magical traps. You can also get a lot of information if you take a look at the random encounter tables of this zone. You could find orc soldiers, some non-player character groups, some stone golems, even Drow. Or you could bump into some powerful creatures such as a horned devil lord. You can see how some of the members of the other factions and the zones throughout the Dungeon of Terror sometimes wander into these chambers of the Mad Mage, and some of them end up in really nasty situations, some of them end up dead. And that's something that I really like of each of these tile sets. You have information of what happens when different members of the factions wander into zones outside of their own territory. So that's really great. They are kind of like adventure seats, or perhaps even side quests. If you somehow become an ally of some of these factions, it could be a side quest in trying to gain their favor. It depends on how you want to handle each of those groups. Maybe some of them aren't as bad as they may seem at first, but if you already have the background information, most of them are quite bad, but nothing says that you cannot modify that for your particular campaign. Then we have a zone ruled by a Lord of the Undead. This is alleged with his vampire mistress. So you can expect to find some zombies, skeletons, wights, morgues. You could come face to face with the vampire and the leak. So all of these tiles of the Lord of the Undead section, I think they will be quite useful for many horror-themed adventures, because you can modify the rooms, remove the furniture, change the orientation of the tiles, modify them in any way that you want, especially thanks to the Rule the Dungeon button. These are the tiles that you're going to be using in all of your horror-themed campaigns and adventures. There is a lot of replayability, reusability when it comes to this section of the dungeon. You have many places for the undead to ambush those adventurers that were a bit careless. You also have a bit of a charnel house type of flavor to some of the rooms. Many different coffins and sarcophagus and mysterious symbols on the floor. I think this could also be a great place for a necromancer to find some eldritch knowledge, or perhaps even gain some alliances with some of the undead creatures here. When it comes to section 7, this is another one of the Mage Chambers. Some of its sections are empty from dungeon denizens. They still have traps and secrets, but some other parts of this section of the Mage Chambers actually have some nasty creatures with plans to make profane sacrifices. So in this part of the dungeon, you may actually bump into Drow carrying a sacrificial victim. You could also find some crawling claws, zombies, non-player characters, and even helmed horrors. Or you could actually bump into some powerful non-player characters, such as Wicca and Zirdan. As to the layout on the tiles on this section and the interior decoratings, they feel quite magical, but of a dark magic type of flavor. You have some details concerning the Drow, some embellishments, ritual in their purpose, but you also have some places where it is obvious that some sort of magical conflict took place, and this will make sense as you read about the background of this section. There is also a game puzzle of sorts, so if you would like to add those type of enigmas or riddles, perhaps the player characters have to participate as some sort of living chess pieces of sorts. This room is going to be very useful to represent that type of challenge. Then we have Scragg's Caverns. This is probably one of my favorite areas of the Dungeon of Terror. This is where a smuggling operation is being carried out. But this particular zone of the Dungeon of Terror connects with the older natural caverns of the dungeon complex. So here you may find sea trolls, smugglers, some strange fungi, mad cultists, and you can also run into some nasty special characters such as a Green Stinger or Niguagrix and Shellbreaker. I think this is one of the best zones if you wanted to connect this Dungeon of Terror to other dungeons of your campaign setting. Maybe there is an underwater tunnel that takes you to other places. Because all of these caves, because they harbor some valuable goods, they could also be perhaps a group of rogues if your party has like bards and thieves and assassins and such. Maybe they could actually go in here and take some of the valuable stuff from the smugglers and sell them on their own. Or maybe they could also make some alliances with the smugglers, who knows what type of campaign you are playing. Nonetheless, I still like these caverns a lot because I think there is a lot of room or excuses to connect these caverns to other dungeons, perhaps even other dimensions in high fantasy games. And then we have a full map of the Dungeon of Terror itself. This is going to be perhaps even crucial if you want to make notes of the different encounters that affect other rooms in different zones. So maybe you're in room 139 and you do something there that could have some impact in room 148. You never know. In all great mega dungeons, all of the factions and their members feel alive. They are doing their own stuff. They are carrying out their own plans regardless of what the player characters are doing. And this Dungeon of Terror is perfect to have those sorts of situations. You even have some information in the background story of the different sections and zones of what happens when a member of a particular faction went into a different room or corridor, or what happens if they potentially trespass into the territory of other factions. This full map of the Dungeon of Terror is going to be great, perhaps to draw some lines and arrows and make small notes and legends and icons, trying to make sense of what is going on in the Dungeon of Terror. This is going to be one of the most useful tools if you want to map out the progress of an entire campaign centered inside the Dungeon of Terror, or even around the Dungeon of Terror. Maybe the adventure starts outside. So what do I think of the Dungeon of Terror virtual box set? I think the value of this virtual box set is insane. You have 164 rooms within 8 different zones. So in total you have 225 customizable tiles. Just imagine that. This is going to last you a lifetime. This is a pack that will allow you to map any dungeon, any haunted mansion, any castle, anything that you can think of in your adventures. And with the Rule the Dungeon button, of course, the customization is pretty much endless. You can remove any furniture that you like, add your own furniture, even a 3D furniture or 2D, it depends on what you handle at your gaming table. And it says here that you can actually, the entire dungeon, if you decide to build all the tiles, it will be a massive 120 by 150 inches dungeon. Just imagine that. I think it would be really cool if, for example, you were to have to take this to a convention. Maybe you could have several parties of adventurers handled by different game masters running at the dungeon at the same time. That would be quite ambitious, but for the most part, for most of us, this virtual box set is a collection of rooms of all sorts of themes, because the different zones of the Dungeon of Terror feature different dungeon flavors, like the Orc's Nest and the Hideout of the Assassins, of the Lord of the Undead, the Smugglers. They have a lot of different themes, all sorts of colors that you can use to represent any story that you can think of in adventures and campaigns for virtually any role-playing game. Any fantasy role-playing game, science fantasy, RPG, and with a little bit of modifications and imagination, you could use it in other types of genres as well. I also like it that they add a lot of even extensive background information for each of the zones and the dungeon itself. That's a lot of campaign seats contained in a single virtual box set. I love that they included the random encounter tables and the way how the different factions interact with each other, the members. All of that could represent side quests. If you are on the law and good side of things, you will probably get some missions in the tavern outside. Maybe this is sort of like an under mountain type of affair. And you get some missions in town or the city, and you go down into this dungeon and you carry out different tasks. Or if, for example, if you're a bit more on the mercenary side of things, maybe you can actually work for some of these factions. As you go into all of the different zones, you could have a sort of like a war between factions. The ways that you can use this virtual box set of the Dungeon of Terror are pretty much endless. So I highly recommend that you get the Dungeon of Terror virtual box set. And remember that at the time of this review, there is an offer at Bundle of Holding that contains many maps from 01 games. Some of them I have reviewed, so I recommend that you check them out. And remember to check out the links in the description of this video as well. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.